Today I'm in Pacific County on the Washington coast. I came here to see a monster and ended up with a ghost story. My name is Kevin, and I'm an artist exploring the world to find inspiration for my next piece of work. Welcome to Art and Adventure. And yeah, only 2 episodes in, I've already changed the name of this series from the Portfolio Adventure Diaries for the sake of clarity. But never mind all that. Today's adventure starts here in the other Long Beach, at Marsh's Free Museum, the only planned destination I had to start my day of discovery. Sasquatch greets visitors on the way in, but he's not the monster I'm here for. After all, he's just a myth, and I'm here to witness reality. Some have described Marsh's as a tourist trap, and a roadside attraction hiding its true intention as a souvenir shop. And while there's some truth to that, Marsh's is still a museum full of oddities and curiosities like taxidermy, frontier relics, weapons, armor, advertising antiques from a bygone era, news about the Titanic tragedy, and a shrunken head purported to be authentic, just to name a few. And here he is, the monster I've come to see, the infamous Jake the Alligator Man. And to be honest, I already knew that he'd be informing today's illustration. The first stories about Jake first appeared many years ago in the Weekly World News, reporting that a half-man, half-alligator had been discovered in a Florida swamp. Subsequent reports about Jake mention his daring escapes from captivity, his life as a notorious serial killer, and about his days as a cigar-smoking bachelor who enjoyed spending most of his time in houses of ill repute. What a guy. Some of the older folks who assumingly knew him say that he was just a sideshow performer and a nightclub dancer who knew how to spin a yarn. There's so many rumors about Jake, I'm not sure what to believe. There's even a report that after an examination, a doctor was quoted claiming that Jake is one of our forefathers. Regardless of what's truth or fiction, Jake the Alligator Man is an interesting character nonetheless. After my visit with Jake was over, I hit the road with a previously unplanned destination. And this is what I love about these adventures: the unexpected, following a whim on preferably empty roads. What sent me down this path was that when I was walking around Marsh's looking for Jake, I saw a few souvenirs for the North Head Lighthouse, only a handful of miles south in Cape Disappointment. And I don't think I've ever heard of a lighthouse that isn't haunted, so I had to check it out. And I wasn't disappointed in Cape Disappointment. This lighthouse does come with a ghost. This is such a beautiful place, and it's an absolutely gorgeous day. It feels hard to believe that anything could go wrong here. The North Head Lighthouse was constructed in 1897 after mariners complained that the Cape Disappointment Lighthouse, about 6 miles south, was obscured to ships approaching from the north. This was important because this area is part of what's called the Graveyard of the Pacific, where more than 2,000 ships have wrecked and over 700 lives have been lost. Today looks idyllic and serene, but I'm told that these are dangerous waters, and that this is one of the most windy and foggy places on the American West Coast, marked by unpredictable storms, shifting sandbars, tidal rips, and rocky reefs and shorelines. The North Head Lighthouse went into operation and was first lit in 1898. Alexander Pessanen was its first keeper, and he lived there with his beloved wife Mary. The two lived there for many years without much incident, in the house on the right. That was the head lightkeeper's home, and the duplex on the left is where the assistant lighthouse keepers lived. Over time, Mary was becoming more and more despondent because of the isolation here, and because of, in her words, the incessant howling of the winds. In the spring of 1923, she had a breakdown, so Alexander took her to see a doctor in Portland, Oregon, where she was diagnosed with melancholia, known today as severe depression. Mary's time getting treatment in Portland seemed to help, so the couple returned to North Head on June 8th of that same year with plans for a new life, away from North Head, since Alexander would be retiring in just 6 months with some very handsome benefits. Things were looking up. At 5 a.m. the next morning, Mary woke up in seemingly good spirits, telling Alexander to go ahead and stay in bed since she was just going out for a walk with their dog Jerry, as she had been advised to do by her doctor. From what I can tell, my best guess is that she walked down this very path that I'm on now. About a half hour after Mary went for her walk, Alexander got up and started to head out to find his wife, and that's when their dog Jerry came back alone, acting very frantic, which made him extremely worried. Initially, Mary couldn't be found, so Alexander organized a search party and called local radio stations so they could help spread the word for people to keep a lookout. In the end, their dog Jerry led searchers to a spot on the cliff near the lighthouse, where Mary's coat was found lying on the ground. And near her coat was evidence that she had slid off the cliff to the jagged rocks and ocean below. The Pessinens were well known and well regarded, so this made news up and down the West Coast. Based on Mary's recent diagnosis, some reported that she ended things on purpose. Other reports say that it was an accident and that along with the slide marks, there was evidence that she had struggled to pull herself back up. Just over 100 years later, we'll probably never know what really happened. Sad nonetheless. Now known as Melancholy Mary, it's said that she haunts these grounds, primarily in the head lightkeeper's house, where she lived with her husband, and which is now a summer rental. So if you've got the coin to stay here, you just may get woken up in the middle of the night to see Mary telling you it's okay to stay in bed, she's just going for a walk. Now, I'm not a big believer in ghosts, but I am intrigued by the stories, and this one lends to the ghost story that's still to come. I had a conversation with a park ranger, and after we briefly talked about my mission here, it was recommended that I go check out the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center. So, I went on a little hike. I wasn't expecting to see ruins off the beaten path. It was a bit of foreshadowing, and when I got back on the paved path, it opened up to reveal an old military fort right in front of the Interpretive Center. This is Fort Canby. The Lewis and Clark expedition arrived here in 1805. During the American Civil War in 1862, this was the site of a Union camp called the Post at Cape Disappointment. It was expanded and renamed Fort Canby in 1875 and was in use until being decommissioned a few years after World War II, when it became part of the Cape Disappointment State Park in the 1950s. What makes me most interested in history, more than events and timelines, is the people who made it and lived it, the people that we never hear about, the ones who don't have statues or have their names recorded in books. As I'm exploring this fort, that's in the forefront of my mind. I'm thinking about the Chinook people who first lived here, all the way through to the very last soldier who served here and locked the doors when this place was first decommissioned. I'm thinking about what their individual lives were like. What stories did they have? What were their dreams? Their motivations? What lessons did they learn? After letting these thoughts swirl around in my head until I was on the brink of an existential crisis, I took a walk around to the front of the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center. The graveyard of the Pacific down the cliff below me. That's the Cape Disappointment Lighthouse in front of me, and just below that is Dead Man's Cove, where the evidence of what the ocean is capable of gets washed ashore. It's the place where Mary Pessinen ended up as well. Inside the Interpretive Center, there's a free museum upstairs with a few artifacts from the Chinook people, some displays with military relics from the fort's history, and a section devoted to some mariner and lighthouse history here in Cape Disappointment. These are some artifacts that washed ashore in Dead Man's Cove from some of the many shipwrecks out in the graveyard of the Pacific. Downstairs is a museum dedicated to Lewis and Clark that I hear is very good and fairly cheap to get in. But aside from the cost of the sack lunch that I brought with me and whatever I spent on gas, I was trying to keep this adventure in the budget-friendly price of free. But that's okay, because I'll be back. There's a lot to do and see around here. Too much for just one day, really, and my mission had been accomplished. It's time to go home, because I know exactly what to draw today, and based on everything I've seen, I've come up with a ghost story to accompany it. In the late 1890s, there was a soldier named Jake, who had been stationed at the fort at Cape Disappointment. After he was discharged from service, Jake decided that he'd stay in the area to start a new life for himself. He liked Pacific County all right, but more importantly, he was head over heels in love with Mary, the lighthouse keeper's daughter. Mary was also madly in love with Jake, and was hoping that the two would be married, but there was a problem. Mary's father didn't approve of their union, and forbade Mary from seeing Jake. These were different times. Mary's father was a respected war hero and a hard worker who was held in the highest esteem within the community. Jake, on the other hand, was regarded as a ne'er-do-well and a loser. Still, he always tried to do the right thing and what was expected of a young man at the time. But no matter what, all his efforts just seemed to move him backwards, and he botched every opportunity and venture he engaged in. Even when he followed well-tread territory with a prescribed set of steps, where others found a clear path to success, he found a way to fall flat on his face. Somehow, despite all of this, Jake was able to get himself a very small leaky boat, and he thought he'd try his hand at being a fisherman. It sounded perfect, and he cursed himself for not thinking of this sooner. After all, he knew the sea, and he was familiar with the Columbia River, and fish, crab, and oysters were plentiful in this area, and in high demand. His competition was doing great and were making fantastic livings. Even though he fished the same spots, used the same methods, and used the same kind of bait, Jake's hauls were meager, not close enough to survive on. Another failure. One evening, after an even worse than usual day on the water, Jake was feeling desperate. So he took what little money he had down to the Masthead pub to drink his sorrows away. and maybe get some tips from the older fishermen who were no doubt celebrating their catches of the day. There was a barmaid at the masthead named Isabel. She was an odd and wiry woman who lived in a shack in the marsh on the outskirts of town. Isabel had big yellowish eyes and a mouth that was too wide and filled with what looked like too many jagged teeth. Her clothes were always tattered and layered in such a way that it looked like she spent all her time in the marsh, waiting for prey before her shift at the bar began. Isabel came across as a no-nonsense woman who was quick to snap at any customer who dared to even get just a little out of line. And there were rumors about her. Some said she was a witch. Some said she was the daughter of Old Scratch himself. And the less superstitious said that her grandfather was a pirate who had buried a king's ransom in treasure on a small island not far from the coast. Several people had gone to look for it, but no one ever found it. Isabel was smitten with Jake and venomously jealous of Mary. And Jake was well aware of how she felt. He thought she looked like a nasty alligator. But he knew that if he was nice to her, he could probably get a free drink or two. Isabel let Jake continue to drink after the pub closed that night while she was cleaning up. Plied with a lot of free drinks, Jake got a little too drunk and a little too loose-lipped. He asked Isabel about some of the rumors he had heard about her. In particular, he was very curious about her grandfather's pirate treasure. She laughed about the rumors that she practiced black magic and about her relation to the devil. But that last rumor, she told Jake that one was true, and she knew where the treasure was hidden. Jake was beside himself and asked her why she didn't go get it. If the treasure was real, she could live like a queen. Isabel just sighed and said, "I don't care about all that." The next night, Jake met Mary at their secret rendezvous spot out of the eyesight of her father, on a cliffside on the other side of the cove from where the lighthouse stood. Jake told Mary everything he had heard from Isabel, and that there really was a pirate's treasure, and the two began to fantasize what they would do with it. If Jake could get that treasure, he'd be rich, and the two could be married. Certainly Mary's father couldn't disapprove of a wealthy suitor who'd have no problem providing for his daughter, so Jake and Mary began to hatch a plan. Mary was also well aware of how Isabel felt, so the plan was for Jake to woo Isabel, and in making her think that he was falling in love with her, they had no doubt that she'd tell him the secret location of the treasure. At first, Jake didn't think he could do it. The thought of pretending to be in love with the alligator girl was repulsive to him, but the thought of his life of poverty and a life without Mary as his bride was worse, so he agreed to go through with it. The very next night, Jake went to the masthead pub acting distraught. When Isabel asked him what was wrong, Jake told her that his relationship with Mary was over. He said that Mary had told him that they had no future together and that she never wanted to see him again. Isabel offered him some sympathy, but when she turned around to pour him a beer, a big smile drew across her face, exposing all her craggy teeth. Jake started hanging around the pub more frequently, hinting at his romantic intentions, and much to his disgust, he started spending time with her away from the masthead as well. When their dates were over, Jake would say goodnight and walk to the docks where he lived on his boat. Then, when he was sure that no one was looking, he'd cut across to meet Mary at their secret spot. This went on for months, and the plan was somewhat working. Isabel had become completely, madly in love with Jake at this point, but Jake wasn't getting any closer to the treasure, and he was getting beyond impatient. Something had to be done. So the following evening, Jake put on a big show for Isabel and professed his love for her. He told her that he didn't want to keep going on unless she'd be his wife. This was everything she ever wanted, but she was confused because Jake said all this with a sad look on his face. When she asked him about it, Jake threw his arms up and, doing his best Shakespeare, exclaimed, "How can I be a good husband when I barely have 2 pennies to rub together?" Isabel told him they don't have to be poor. After all, she knew where her grandfather's treasure was buried. Jake tried to hide his excitement, and he got careless. When he said goodnight to Isabel that evening, he didn't walk towards the docks. He headed straight to go see Mary at their secret meeting place, with an exuberant, jaunty bounce in his step. What he didn't know is that Isabel had noticed. So, she followed him. While hiding in the bushes, Isabel watched as Jake embraced Mary. Her heart was ripped to shreds. She listened to Jake and Mary discuss their plans, the ruse they were making her a victim of, and she heard Jake referring to her with disdain in his voice, calling her the alligator girl, over and over. Isabel's eyes filled with rage, and she spent most of the rest of her night in her shack screaming curses to Jake and Mary. That very next morning, Isabel rushed to the docks to find Jake before he went out for another day on the water attempting to be a fisherman. Since she had told Jake that the treasure was real, she wasn't surprised to find him having a lazy morning. Isabel took a deep breath and put on her most cheerful face, approached Jake, handed him a folded piece of parchment, and said, "Here's the map. Go get us that treasure." Then she turned and began walking towards the masthead to start her day of work. Jake couldn't believe he had the map, and he waited until Isabel was out of sight, and then he ran to Mary's house to show her, at a time when he knew that her father would be at the lighthouse making sure the oil was full so the light would burn without problem for another night. Jake estimated that his trip would take at least a couple days, if not a little bit longer, and that Mary should wait for him at their spot on the cliff. Jake planned to return to shore at night to hide his bounty, and told Mary that he'd signal her with a lantern to let her know that he was coming in with the treasure, and to whisk her away to their new life as a rich married couple. Jake spent the rest of that day making his preparations, and set out in his boat the next morning at dawn's first light. As he was sailing in the direction of the island, it seemed to be a little bit farther than he had expected, and the sea was a bit rougher than he thought it'd be this time of year, impeding his progress somewhat. But before the sun went down on the following day, the island came into sight. Overjoyed, Jake greedily took out the map. He unfolded it to look at that beautiful X marks the spot, but it was blank. All the ink lines that he had seen before that laid out the coastline and the island features were gone. There was no more X marks the spot. And just as Jake's heart was traveling into his throat, the parchment exploded into an eerie green fireball that engulfed his body. The searing pain was more than he could bear, and before he could jump in the water to put it out, his bones began to creak and his skin crackled, with an agony that made a trip to Davy Jones' locker sound like heaven. His suffering continued as his whole body felt like it was being stretched and expanding as his innards felt as if they were being ripped apart and rearranged. Right before Jake thought he was losing consciousness, his feet hit the bottom of the ocean floor. His ordeal was over. The pain went away. Jake's confusion was an understatement. He was standing firmly, waist high in the water. He thought he must be on a sandbar. Then he looked down. His boat was just kindling in the water around him, and it looked too small. The size of the wreckage made him feel like a giant. He looked at his arms. His skin was scaly. His hands looked like giant reptile claws, and then he saw his reflection in the water. In protest, only growling, guttural sounds escaped his mouth. He thought, this has to be a nightmare. What the hell just happened? Am I dead? Am I in hell? No. He could feel the cold ocean water around him. He could feel the breeze in the air, and the sky looked just like it had before he was swallowed by that mysterious green fire. Jake's next thoughts immediately went to Mary, and he began trudging back to the cape. His huge size sent massive waves towards the shoreline as he moved, and those waves sent the pieces of his wrecked boat surfing their way to the coast ahead of him. In the darkness, Mary was waiting patiently, just like she did every night, right on the cliff between the cove below and the lighthouse across from that. The waves were extra rough, and looked to be getting worse. They never got high enough to reach the top of the cliff, but tonight it looked like they were getting closer and closer. Mary was getting worried. Then, as the lighthouse lamp panned over the cove, she saw it, the unmistakable pieces of Jake's destroyed boat washing ashore. Just as extreme panic and sadness were starting to take hold of her, Mary looked up in horror as a giant, hideous, half-man, half-alligator monster was coming out of the ocean, reaching towards her. Instinctively, she turned to run, but in her fright, she slipped just as one of the waves grabbed her off the cliffside, taking her out to sea, to never be seen alive again. Jake had failed once more. He couldn't reach her in time to save her from the dangerous surf his massive body and poor judgment created. Those few who witnessed this happen say that the monster began to look as if it was crying, put its head down, and lumbered slowly back out to sea. Now, over 100 years later, this story has become a legend. Locals say that if the sea is angry near the lighthouse around Halloween night, that means Jake is coming back inland to try to save Mary from being taken away by the sea. Locals also say that you can see their ghosts, cursed to repeat that tragic moment, losing each other over and over again, year after year. No one really knows what happened to Isabel, but from what I've heard, the rumors about her grandfather's buried treasure was a lie. She liked to keep that one in her back pocket for an occasion where she could use it. But those other rumors, you've probably guessed it by now, were true. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate you spending your time with me. There's some exclusive stuff over there on Patreon. I'd love to have you over there as well. It'll help me make more of this stuff. Thanks again, and stay sharp.